Hi, I'm Reid Kapple. I'm the campus pastor of the Olathe campus of Christ Community. And with me again is Stan Wallace, the president and CEO of Global Scholars and also a member of our Olathe campus. And Stan was with us several weeks ago as we talked about the opening verses of Genesis and the questions around creation and how we understand the way in which God has set up the world. And today we're engaging an equally challenging topic, the problem of evil. And this is really right within, Stan, your wheelhouse. Your background is in philosophy and apologetics, and so just really easy, lighthearted conversation about the problem of evil. But I'm guessing you would agree that this has got to be one of the most prominent barriers of entry for people in terms of faith and plausibility in the belief of a God. I mean, the classic problem of evil is that if there is a good God who is infinitely wise, infinitely loving, infinitely powerful, how could he possibly allow evil, suffering, gratuitous evil of all kinds to exist in this world? And so the question's been asked in various ways, and I'm sure you have responded to it in various ways, but I would just love for you to give us a response to that question. How do we deal with the problem of evil with a good, loving, all-powerful, knowing God? Curious your thoughts.
Well, and like you said, it's a very important issue, but a very nuanced issue. Would take obviously longer than we have to unpack. But just in general, when the question comes up, I always like to first help the person clarify what exactly they want to talk about. Because some people are asking the question because they've got a rational objection to God's existence. They want to wrestle through, are there good reasons to believe God might allow evil? And it's purely cognitive. For other people, and maybe the majority of people, it's actually more personal. They've lost a loved one, some tragedy has occurred, and they just can't make sense of it.
It's not theoretical. It's
not
personal.
theoretical at all. And so those discussions are very different discussions. In fact, C.S. Lewis had this occurrence. He wrote a book called The Problem of Pain, and in it he gives a very philosophical response to this question. Several years later, he gets married. His wife dies of cancer not long after, and he wrestles with this in a very personal way and writes A Grief Observed.
Grief Observed,
Entirely different treatment, the same topic. And so that's what we need to do is approach this the way the questioner is approaching it. Now, having said that, if they're asking about the rational issue and really want answers, we need to be able to offer those. And the short answer is that God has created a world that includes a wild card called free will. People who actually can choose good or evil. And choice entails live options, or it's not a choice. And if it's a live option, people actually can choose the evil. Often they do. Evil results. So the only other option would be for God not to create free agents who can't make choices. And at the end of the day, he chose to do so in order to create a world where there is a community of people who can actually engage in relationship with one another, in loving community. You kind of lose love if you lose Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the world he decided was best, even though it came with the perils of some freely choosing not to love and to hate and to engage in that which is evil. And ultimately, it's called the free will defense, and it explains the evil we see by and large in the world.
That's good. That's really good. And I also, it's really helpful to start with that framing of, I've heard it said, like, some people need cold answers, like just the logical response to the problem of evil, but some people need warm answers of like, how do I deal with this real tragedy that I've gone through? And sometimes that question, and this is probably more on the cold side of things, where it's, how could there possibly be a good reason that God would allow this evil and suffering to take place? And sometimes we conclude, well, if I can't see any reason why God would allow this evil to take place, there can't be any good reason. And that can be a rather fantastically arrogant claim to say, because I can't see it, because that requires an infinite knowledge, a perspective that we don't have. And I remember hearing this, I think it's a Middle Eastern folklore. Ravi Zacharias, I think, is the one who I remember hearing it, is that, you have a gentleman who had a horse that ran away, and his neighbor comes in and says, "Isn't that terrible? Bad luck to you, your horse ran away." And he says, I guess so. But then the horse comes back the next day with 20 other wild horses. And his neighbor's like, oh, what good luck, your horses came back. He's like, well, what do I know about this? But then one of the wild horses kicks his son, and now he broke his back. And he's like, oh, this is bad luck. But then the neighboring gang comes to recruit kids from the neighborhood, and they don't take his son because he's crippled. And so like it goes back and forth. Like we never know the reasons for why things are happening because we have such a finite perspective. And so again, that may be more of a cold answer, but it's helpful to know where people are coming from and how we respond to this question. That's really good.
Really, and I might also mention briefly that at one day it was assumed that the problem of evil, actually a form called a logical problem of evil, that it's logically impossible for God to exist if evil exists. It was assumed that that was in academic circles a knockdown, drag out, that there's no way God could exist. And in the last probably 50 years, Christian philosophers have done excellent work.
Yeah.
And that no longer is on the table.
Alvin Plantinga is a big guy who's helped with that.
His God, Freedom, and Evil was probably the seminal work that started to show that it was not actually a good reason to deny God's existence. Now there are other forms of the problem of evil still in play and are being responded to, but the point is that it's really not the knockdown, drag out argument it used to be for an atheist, because there are good answers to these objections.
Yeah, God, Freedom, and Evil. It's a small book, but it's a dense book. It's very dense, and so that's good. Okay, so we have a little bit of an understanding now of the problem of evil, how we can reconcile God and evil in this world. But what about the origin of evil itself, of spiritual evil, of ultimate evil? Essentially, as we look at the narrative in Genesis 3, there's the question that even a 5-year-old would ask, where did this serpent come from? How do we can understand how evil has entered into the human world, but how do we make sense of the origin of Satan, the adversary? How do we make sense of the origin of evil itself? How would you respond to that question?
Well, I'd say that it's the same answer in a variant, namely that God created free creatures named angels, who by virtue of having freedom chose in some cases to rebel and to exercise that freedom to not enter or stay in the loving community God had created for them with him, but rebelled and became the angels we know as demons, which then of course led to our temptation and fall as humans. But it's important to realize that's a very different story than two other stories that are often told that we have to be careful not to embrace in one way or another. One is the idea that there are these equal and eternal forces of good and evil that exist. And God is the good force, and there's this evil force that are always eternally in this war. That's not a biblical notion. Ultimately, God created everything, and everything was good at creation, though some things had the capacity or potential to become evil via freedom, but they were all good at creation. So they're not these two equal and opposite forces, a la the Star Wars theology about origins of evil, but it's actually from a creation of God that had that capacity to be evil. Related to that, though, some might want to say, therefore, God created evil because he created these creatures that became evil or chose evil. Now, that's not the case either. In other words, if God could create evil, he has to have some capacity for evil himself. No, he creates the capacity to choose, which is a good. Free will, choice is good. But in doing so, that also means that these creatures then can create evil. And create evil is actually a misnomer. They can choose not the good. Because evil isn't actually a thing. It's the absence of something. It's the absence of good. It's like darkness is the absence of light. Evil is the absence of goodness.
That's a great metaphor.
And that's really important to understand. Such that God created the possibility for evil to exist simply because he created the choice for people, the ability for people to choose not to be good and therefore to be evil.
That's really helpful
as well.
And still this is still an issue that's filled with some mystery as well. I mean, we can't fully know it in all its detail. If we could figure it out, there's a sense in which God would cease to be God. If we could master and understand his mind, you lose the wonder and the awe of who God is, because you don't worship something that you can figure out entirely, and so that's really helpful. Okay, so relatedly, the problem of evil has typically been a problem for theists, for Christians, for people of faith. But in some ways, it's equally a problem for the atheist, for the person who would reject the idea of a supernatural realm. In what ways is the problem of evil helpful for Christians in dialoguing with those who hold opposing viewpoints? I'm sure many of you have probably asked this question to some degree.
Yeah. Well, I think it's probably one of 3 reasons that this is a helpful conversation to have with non-believers. Namely, to your point, what's called the problem of good, the problem of goodness. If there is no God, there is no objective standard of right and wrong, because all that is the material world, or some eternal force of who knows what. And so that person has a real problem saying why something is actually evil. Now, they will often give an answer of, well, because it doesn't help people, or it doesn't help alleviate suffering or whatever. But that just pushes it one step back. Then you ask, well, why is it good to help people or bad to alleviate suffering? And eventually, the answer is, well, I just believe it is, but I can't actually ground it. As opposed to those of us who believe there's a God who's ultimately and supremely good. We can ground goodness and
ultimate good backstop, essentially.
Exactly. We can ground it in his nature. So the problem of goodness is a real problem for the atheist and the pantheist, actually, as well. But secondly, the question shows that a person really has something they want to talk about. I have more of a struggle with people who are apathetic and really have no interest in any conversation at all, as opposed to somebody who's asking, why is there evil if there's God? Well, now we've at least got some issue that they and I are interested in, and we can discuss and engage and dialogue on. And actually, I can hopefully help them see there's some good reasons to believe a good, loving God exists while there also is evil in the world. And thirdly, related to that, it segues into the gospel very nicely, because ultimately evil is what Jesus came to identify with, to experience himself most directly, and then to conquer and redeem. And so there's a way that they're asking questions ultimately that are only answered by the gospel.
That's beautiful, and that brings up this broader question of, like, why wouldn't God just allow the world to stay within its state of perfection and goodness? Why do we see this plan and path of redemption and forgiveness? Why not just keep everything innocent and perfect? And there's got to be a sense in which there's a greater good and a greater glory to be seen in God in more than just things remaining innocent, but in things being redeemed. And sometimes this is where our logic and philosophy may fail us, and sometimes this is where poetry can help us. And I remember hearing the lyrics of Andrew Peterson, who talks about this very concept. He says, "And when the world is new again, and the children of the King are ancient and in their youth again, maybe it's a better thing to be more than merely innocent, but to be broken than redeemed by love. Maybe this old world is bent, but it's waking up, and I'm waking up." And I think as we think about it, it's beautiful right there in Genesis 3, as evil enters the world, we also see the promise that the snake crusher, Jesus, will come to redeem and restore all things, and that evil will not have the final word. And so I love that you brought us back to the gospel is really the answer to this problem. So
it really is.
This is great, Stan. Again, so much more we could talk about, obviously.
There is.
I would encourage you as well, if you'd like to learn more about this. Stan is a phenomenal thinker and writer. Check out his blog that we'll link in the notes. And so hopefully you check that out for more conversation. But Stan, again, thanks for your time and for blessing us with your thoughts and mine. And so truly, truly an honor to have you.
It's an honor to talk about these things with you.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks.